What's up everyone, this is the final video in a series where I'm digitally inking the Shaded Grove and Xofl Fae Hound for the Mystic Punks RPG adventure Crackdown at Ivy Park, which will be available from Exalted Funeral in the near future. Benjamin Mara here, illustrator and cartoonist. Welcome to my channel where I record my art process and give insights about the projects I'm working on with the hope you'll learn new techniques and be inspired when making your own art. I'm in the home stretch here with this piece and I'm just putting some final touches on everything. Right now I'm just adding or taking away some flames from the shadows, like the dog's foot and some of the table. The flames aren't really turning out how I want them to, but I'm just going to leave it because it is what it is. Now I'm going through the dog, the Xofl Fae Hound I should say, and adding in the shadows there to render out the form of the creature. I'm adding these large black shapes because the fur of the Xofl Fae Hound is all black and a short black fur. Just I remember that from the description. I'm making sure that the tangents on the flames aren't going to interfere too much with the form of the dog. I like adding these large black shapes to this creature because it gives it a real sense of weight and presence. It's sort of like a menacing creature, so I want to use these large black shadows to convey that. I'm adding all the shadows using just the pen tool because I want to make sure there's a lot of detail in the face. I'm not sure exactly where the shadows are going to fall, so I just want a little bit of freedom with the pen tool to find those shadows organically and create these organic shapes, not be too precise and just lay them in as quickly as I can. I know that the viewer's eye is going to go toward the place in the image with the highest concentration of contrast. All of this concentration of contrasting detail and forms of shadow and highlight in the dog's face is going to draw the viewer's eye to this spot in the composition, which is pretty important because this creature is really the reason why the characters in the foreground are in such terror. The highlights and shadows across the back of the Xofl Fae Hound are, I'm imagining there is some kind of light source like a moon or some kind of light overhead that's striking the back of the creature, so I'm just trying to imagine what the highlights and shadows would look like striking shiny black fur of this dog. I'm feeling pretty good about how the dog is looking. Now I'm dropping in some cast shadows to kind of anchor it to the environment ground, or the ground that it's standing on. In retrospect, I probably should have added some kind of texture to the ground, some kind of grass or something like that. But I know that that area is going to be filled up with this smoke effect as well, so perhaps I really didn't need it. Now I'm just going through the roof of the pavilion, which I imagine is made up of these tiles, kind of like these tar tiles or something. It's decrepit and I imagine that it hasn't been maintained in a long time. To start, I'm just putting in some crosshatch lines, making sure that it's just got some kind of ground texture that I can dig into or work off of. And now I'm adding some forms of like some moss or some sort of like water damage that's been etched into the surface of these tiles. I want to make sure that it's looking pretty gross and drippy and kind of like slimy. Now I'm going back into the flames. I'm not really too happy with how the explosion is looking with the grill, but like I said, I can't really do too much about it. I'm not really feeling like I'm gaining much ground by working on it too much. I'm going back in and adding the texture to the roof of the pavilion now, making sure it's all drippy and gross. I want it to look kind of like Cronenberg's Surface or any sort of horror movie, maybe a Wes Craven, Friday the 13th sort of nightmare. Yeah, I'm just using the pen tool as a eraser and digging into the blacks and digging into the cross-hatching that I put down before, adding some drips, details to make sure it looks really gross. So now I'm making a mask on the final ink. So this layer has a mask on it now, and I'm testing out some other tools that I can use to create the fog or the mist effect that I want to have to obscure sort of like the background, have the Xofl Fae Hound emerging from. I believe in the description it said that a mist is kind of rolling in and the Fae Hound is coming from that mist. shapes. I'm also using it to kind of break up the harsh black background, give it a little bit of texture. And now I'm going to go in with another layer and the same spray can tool, add some black tones to the underside of some of these tendrils of mist or fog to give it a little bit of volume, so it actually looks like it's, these shapes of fog are kind of moving in. Because it's a mask, I'm able to preserve all of the inks that are there, and I can just use the mask tool to edit out the parts of the fog that I don't want to encroach on the more foreground elements, just so it gives it a little bit of more of the depth of field. I don't want the fog to come too far forward that it's interfering with some of the flames or interfering with some of the portions of the dog itself. So like the face, I want to go back and pull the face out of the fog a little bit. I'm adding more and more layers to add these other elements, such as the screen tones here. I love these dot screen tones and using them in Clip Studio. It's just such a great feature. I really think that these screen tones add so much to the black and white drawing. It gives like detail to the drawing, or a feeling of detail when there actually isn't that much detail being done. It does so much heavy lifting, but it's such a simple thing. It really gives these figures that much more volume and form, and I feel like they have so much more weight and gravity. If I can add this mid-tone of gray with the screen tones, I'm adding in some of the highlights to the dog's eyes, which I forgot to do before, which are a critical part of that high contrast of concentration in the face. I want to make sure that the balance of grays and blacks is to my liking. I don't want it to be too gray. I want the black ink, quote unquote ink, to really be the dominant part of this. But the screen tones are there to really enhance the black shadows, and the screen tones really help to set off the white highlights and they buttress the black shadows. Now I'm just adding in some wood textures here, the pillars of the pavilion. I also want to add some wood texture to the table because I want the table to sit behind those figures in the foreground, and if I put a pattern on the table, it's going to push them forward a bit. So I'm adding the wood grain texture to the bench, and then I'll add the wood grain texture as well to the top of the table. And it's a really subtle technique, but I find that it really helps a lot in differentiating forms. I use texture a lot to separate forms from one another in a black and white drawing. If you have just black and white, a lot of the time the drawing can look really flat, but using textures like a wood grain or textures on metal, I always like adding those glints to metal to really enhance that feeling of the surface of steel or iron. And it also just gives the light source, like the exploding grill, it just supports that logic of the light sort of striking these metallic surfaces. Finally, I'm just going into the trees and giving a little bit of highlight to the pine needles, the pine trees. Going to add a little bit of accent the silhouettes of the trees so that they read as pine trees a little bit more than just these triangular shapes across the skyline. I might have wanted to put in the gray sky, maybe with the screen tones, but I didn't think to do that. Now the image is done. This is the final image. Pretty happy with how it all turned out, and really happy that I made the decision to go with a more mannerist composition rather than something that was more straightforward. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have any questions about what I've been working on or anything that I mentioned in the video, leave them in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer them. See you in the next video.